Democracy is the rule of the people, essentially. That's how it breaks down. And the word certainly comes from the ancient Greek and refers to the institutions of places like Athens, where for a variety of internal political reasons, the people ended up taking control of the government themselves.
The great ancient Greek historian Herodotus is the first to use the word Demokratia to describe this new radical form of government. Yet there is growing archaeological evidence to suggest that democratic ideas existed before Athens.
I mean, it's been interesting in the last couple of years. I've been doing more research about the development of democracy in the early city-states of and those Mesopotamian states, which are kind of relevant to the introduction of democracy in Iraq at the moment.
This view is shared by Professor John Keane, who established the Centre for Democracy at Westminster University in London and sees democracy consisting of two phases.
I think in this first phase of democracy, democracy means self-government through the assembly. And assemblies are an Eastern invention. Lots of archaeological evidence now is surfacing of assemblies in the cities and also the countryside of Syria, Mesopotamia. And they get transported partly to the east, to what is today Pakistan and Western India, and they also get transported to the west. And they get picked up in the Hellenic world, where particularly the Athenians claim Demokratia as their own invention.
By far the most complete and reliable evidence survives from ancient Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. Not only is there a huge amount of archaeological evidence still being discovered, but completed texts still survive. Philosophies by Plato and Aristotle, histories by Herodotus, Plutarch and Thucydides, comedies and tragedies by Aristophanes, Sophocles, Euripides and Aeschylus.
It's thanks to the Athenians that we have the best documented account of all the trimmings and trappings of democracy. And there the idea is that democracy is a special, unusual kind of polity where male citizens who consider themselves as equals, women are excluded, foreigners are excluded, slaves are not included, that these male equals can gather in the paniques, in the assembly, and they can put motions, they can debate them, and they can agree by a show of hands or placing a piece of pottery in a jar. They can agree on what's to be done. And this was an extraordinary invention.
I wanted to find out more about ancient Greek democracy and how it compared to democracy today. So before I flew out to Athens, I interviewed Dr. David Pritchard from the Classics Department at Sydney University.
The basic difference is that we have a representative form of democracy, whereas ancient Greece had a participatory form of democracy. So in our representative system, we elect representatives to conduct politics on our behalf. This means that ordinary voters don't have any role in the day-to-day conducting of politics, and that often our only political activity comes in the form of voting in elections or in referendums. In classical Greece, by contrast, participants were involved in a very real way in day-to-day politics. They were able to turn up to the regular meetings of the Assembly and the Council where public business was discussed. At those meetings they were free to speak themselves about political issues or what the city should do, and they also voted on what the city should do itself. So they had a direct role in the discussion of politics and also in political decision making.
I finally made it to Athens and met my guide Gemma on top of one of the hills that surrounds the city. Gemma explained to me that the ancient Greeks had to adapt to the conditions around them. The mountainous terrain and lack of rainfall had forced them to develop intensive farming techniques where certain crops would flourish under these conditions. This led to long sea trade and the introduction of coinage. It developed a merchant class that became affluent and changed the dynamics within the city-states.
Well, I think that Athens was the kind of town that was made for democracy. It really depended to a large extent. The power was in the hands of traders and entrepreneurs of various kinds. The aristocrats who had been in power there, hadn't adapted well to changing conditions. And I think this is one of the useful aspects of democracy all down its history, is that it's very good at adapting to changing conditions.
The Greeks settled into self-sufficient communities known as city-states. Their language, culture and religion bound them together, and by the 8th century BC they managed to transform the linear script from the Phoenicians and streamlined it by adding vowels to represent their language. It revolutionised the way people communicated, as it allowed a permanent and accurate record that was universally understood within the Greek world.
Ordinary Athenians perceived the possibility of democracy through slow political developments, such as the introduction of magistracies, and the need for such a development because of the bad behaviour of their upper class. In the course of the 6th century, members of that class were forever fighting with each other, hashing up public affairs, and getting themselves and ordinary people killed. And at the end of those shenanigans, at the end of a century of shenanigans, ordinary Athenians said, enough is enough, and really it's a time that we're involved in public life because we feel that our involvement will ensure that public life is managed more successfully.
The first thing that needed changing was the draconian laws that were extremely harsh and forced many Athenians into slavery. This was called debt bondage, where the farmers had to pay 1/6 of the produce to their landowners. It took a few key reformers to change all this.
These reformers or lawgivers, in fact, had a significant impact on the direction that Athenian public life took. And really the first significant figure of this sort is the Athenian lawgiver Solon, who was active in Athenian politics in the first half of the 6th century. And he brought in important laws which meant that ordinary citizens were in a better financial situation. He outlawed debt bondage, for example, and also forms of debt which impacted negatively on the prosperity of ordinary citizens. He also strengthened laws about homicide, introduced new laws, and instituted the first jury court in the city to facilitate the resolution of disputes through legal means as opposed to violence.
Solon also divided the Athenian population into 4 census classes based on their ability to produce income from their land and their contribution to the military. Regardless, his reforms did not go far enough, and Athens was taken over by a tyrant named Pisistratos.
In the course of his reign as the tyrant, he introduces important reforms. So he encourages economic prosperity in the 6th century Athens. He also consolidates the institutions of the city, such as the board of dean judges or village judges whom he institutes. And he also encourages the worship of Athena through the establishment of the festival of the great Panathenaea. These are all very significant developments, and they suggest that he had some interest in stability, and these developments strengthen the idea of community and also show that public business doesn't have to be about elite competition alone. It can involve new public institutions to mediate and direct public life.
When Pisistratos died, his 2 sons Hippias and Hipparchus took over. When Hipparchus was murdered by one of the rival factions, Hippias set out to avenge his brother's death. But unlike his father Pisistratos, Hippias ruled unjustly. The people of Athens rose up and demanded a new leader, a leader that would give them a say in how they were governed. Cleisthenes became the new leader and is regarded as the founder of democracy in ancient Athens. He abolished Solon's 4 classes and replaced them with 10 tribes based on electorates rather than class, and named them after great Athenian heroes. Each tribe was in turn divided into 10 demis, which became the basis of local government. The tribes each elected 50 members to a council called the Boulae, which governed Athens on a day-to-day basis. The assembly, or ecclesia, was open to all citizens and provided democratic equality for the people of Athens.
At the end of the day, we have democracy in Athens because ordinary people stood up and said, we want a role in the governing of our city. We want to adjudicate the disputes of the upper class. So really there are two players, so to speak, in the history of democracy in ancient Athens.
In fact, a system of ostracism was established to keep the balance between these two key players. If the people thought a politician abused their power, they could write their name on a piece of clay called an ostracon. The politician would lose their position and would be exiled from the city for a set amount of time. Pericles, on the other hand, was an Athenian statesman that held his post for over 30 years, and he heavily contributed to the democracy in Athens. One of his greatest achievements was the building of the Acropolis.
Pericles owed his position really to the power of his oratory. And in fact he is seen as an important figure in Athenian politics in helping to develop oratory and public speaking as an activity of the democracy. And we have fragments of famous speeches by him which were quoted by people throughout antiquity because of their wit and their powerful rhetoric.
I started to make my way up to the Panika Hill, where Pericles delivered many of his famous speeches. Thucydides, the great ancient Greek historian who wrote about the 30-year war between Athens and Sparta, transcribed a speech made by Pericles at a funeral procession in which Pericles praises the soldiers for giving up their lives to protect Athens and its democracy. Well, I finally made it to the most important area in ancient Greece for democracy. This is the Pnyx Hill, and just behind me is the Pnyx, or the Panika in Greek. It's where all the speakers in Athens addressed the assembly. And this is where the democratic process in Athens happened. On the other side of the hill is the Acropolis, which is the most noticeable landmark, and where most of the tourists are today. The fact that the Parthenon and other structures still stand is testament to Pericles' vision to commission the buildings on the Acropolis 2,500 years ago. There is no doubt that democracy improved the lives of the citizens of Athens, and it's no coincidence that this period produced a huge amount of human endeavour with just democracy. The Olympic Games, philosophy, science, music, art, architecture, literature, drama, comedy, and a large amount of the English language. But the waging of war eventually took its toll on Athens.
The Athenians were able to maintain the democracy for 200 years, and one reason for that is that they were a reasonably powerful military power throughout the classical period, and as such they could stop enemies from conquering them and putting down the democracy. However, when they lost that capacity to protect themselves, when they lost the capacity to maintain their independence from military rivals, then their democracy was in trouble. So right at the end of the classical period, in the last decades of the 4th century, Athens loses badly to the new kid on the block, the new military power in the Mediterranean, the Macedonians. And as a result, they have to put up with a garrison in their city, which polices a new political order, which is much narrower than democracy. So really, at the end of the day, it was the inability of the Athenians to stand up or to challenge effectively a significant new military power which allowed the overthrow of their democracy by an external power.